There are many RTS games out there on the market, from Age of Empires to Red Alert. But there is one that is not so much overlooked as not really known at all. Hi, I'm Chris, and today we'll take an in-depth look at Original War. It's an RTS going all the way back to the year 2001, made by a Czech studio Alter Interactive, so a year after the already mentioned Red Alert and even Red Alert 2. It has a rather niche feel to it, but that doesn't mean that it should be overlooked. There are two campaigns in this game, which further branch out in the latter half of the game, but for this video I will be playing the American one, and from time to time dip my toes into the Russian campaign, and at the end I will give a brief summary for the branching choice of those storylines. And as a side note, I will be using USSR and Russians interchangeably in this video. I very well know that those two words doesn't mean the same thing, but the game treats it as such, so I will do the same. But first thing first, what is the frame of this game anyway? You see, somewhere during the First World War, an American expedition to Siberia discovered an unknown object they dubbed Ion. After they brought it back to America, they soon realized that they have no more, no less than an honest-to-God time machine on their hands. But no fuel to run it, as most of what they had was used during trials. And here comes the second new concept on the stage, Cyberite. Sorry if I butchered the name, but that is how I think it's pronounced, so I will go with that. Cyberite is a compound that can produce untold amounts of energy, without irradiating everything around it. At least that is what the intro says, but I have my doubts about that, but we will come to that when we'll come to that. But the vast majority of this precious mineral is, as the name suggests, in Siberia, at least for the US campaign. So the American government decided to send an expedition into the past, 2 million years into the past to be precise, to the period where Siberia and Alaska were linked by land, to extract and transport all the Cyberite to the territories now held by the US. Yeah, it seems far-fetched, and it honestly is. But it's a fun concept that only by sheer chance has the potential to have more holes poked into it than a Swiss cheese. But I will consciously try not to dwell on the mechanics of the time travel part of this game, or rather the problems it logically poses. I will treat that mechanic straightforwardly, for the most part, as not to get into a rabbit hole that will be difficult to come out of. Let's just say that it's the frame and leave it at that. Although the name of the game, Original War, has everything to do with that time travel frame. As you might have put together by now, it's derived from the concept of the original sin, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and sinned for the first time against their maker, and as a consequence they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. In this case, we have a war that predates all wars, the progenitor of all human conflict, so to speak. In this world 2 million years in the past, thus the original war. It's a curious thing that the first thing that humans did after arriving in the past was to take up arms against one another. Well, war never changes. So, now let's get right to our American campaign. We meet our main guy, John Macmillan, just when he is about to step into the Eon as one of the first to do so. But it doesn't mean that he will be the first to arrive. The machine is rather unprecise, with a few-year margin of error. But I will not keep you waiting any longer. Let's step into the Eon and arrive somewhere in North America 2 million years in the past. But there is something strange happening. There is some irritating asshole on the radio and Russian patrols everywhere. What? Russian patrols? Well, they sure sound Russian. How the heck did they get here? Do they also have the Eon? And how do they have tanks 2 million years BC? Okay, wait. These questions won't help me now anyway, so let's carry on. There are apparently still 2 more soldiers around, so let's find them and get out of here. Although I must say that traversing the map with my troops isn't half that bad. They move slower when going uphill or walking through high grass, and they see further on hills. I already see defensive applications for this if I ever get to build a base. Although that would mean that storming a well-fortified position will be a bitch. But I guess we will see. The graphics are also quite nice, even in 2022, with drawn backgrounds and honestly very well made sprites. There is an aesthetic to this game that not many others have. Even counting the newer ones, it somehow feels, well, comfy, for a lack of a better word. It really feels like there are not that many people around. Plus, getting your troops through a forest can take quite a while, as there are those goddamn trees everywhere. But this is another advantage really, as it adds a bit more variety to the maps. And it makes sense seeing as it still is an untamed world. Yeah, the vehicle or rocket animations might seem a bit off, and the maps are sometimes too small, especially for tank combat. But all in all, these are really small gripes when compared to the rest of the visual design. As far as I'm concerned, it still holds up big time. Each faction building is unique, and some maps can be straight up picturesque. But I just remembered one more problem I had with the visual design: the vehicles. They are distinctive between each faction. The Americans seem light and nimble, the Russian ones are heavy and big. But the visual variety between each separate vehicle in any given side is rather small. That means that, for example, a heavy-wheeled Russian tank is not that different compared to a heavy tank with tracks. Don't get me wrong, they differ somewhat, but still are very similar to each other, to a point that I sometimes had a problem to distinguish between them only based on visual cues. Maybe it's a consequence of how they are built, but I would like to see more of a difference between a tank with tracks and one with wheels. We will talk about the vehicles more coming up, but for now that is all. Let's get back to the story. After we get away from that rather unwelcoming party, my team makes contact with some other Americans, and the whole group is now to storm and take over a nearby enemy base, as per radio orders. I am really starting to dislike that dick on the other side of the radio. But it seems that this time there are some other people than just soldiers in my group, 2 engineers and 1 scientist to be precise. This is the other rather unique feature in this game. There are character classes, or rather jobs, 4 in total. There is one that is still absent from my group, but I will talk about all of them anyway. They are pretty self-explanatory and extremely specialized. The first I got to command in the US campaign is the soldier. That's the heavy hitter of all classes, armed most likely with an automatic weapon, although not exclusively. If you want to clear out a pillbox or turret, there is no one better for the job. There comes even a moment where a proper high-level soldier is better than many of the game's tanks. A group of 5, maybe 6 properly trained soldiers is a force to be reckoned with. The one downside is that outside of a vehicle or a building they can still be wounded, which is actually a major drawback, but more on that later. There is one more thing concerning the soldier that I will also come around to in due time, when it makes more sense to talk about it, when more things are already established and explained. Next is the engineer, your specialist when it comes to building stuff. It's the only class that can start a new construction. What is interesting, he or she just has to lay the foundation, the rest of your party can finish it. But still, the engineer will be most proficient at it. They are also responsible for collecting resources and moving them if you don't have a transport vehicle, which is most often the case in the early stages of a mission. The fact that they can repair buildings is also self-explanatory. But truth be told, once I got everything built that I wanted, they soon became soldiers or scientists, as at some point it makes much more sense to have more firepower than to let them stand idly by, or leave them in the storage. Well, maybe I would leave one for any emergency, if I knew that I had to build something new later on, or constantly keep repairing barracks or turrets. Either way, they are immensely useful, because no engineer means no base, and building stuff is the bread and butter of RTS games. That is where the fun is. To be honest, I hate missions where I have to make do without building anything. Most of the time they irritate me to no end. The other specialist that is also responsible for building stuff is the mechanic. Every vehicle or weapon on a tower will be built by them, and differently than in the case of the engineer, they have to do it from start to finish. If you don't have a mechanic in the factory, it simply won't work. No amount of other professions will do you any good. They can also repair any tank or remotely pilot them. We'll come to the piloting part in a bit. They will also push a vehicle if it runs out of fuel. Although, I really question why only they are able to do that. Sure, building and repairing them makes sense, but pushing? It doesn't strike me as a task that requires some special knowledge to perform. What is interesting is that a soldier in a tank will be far less capable than a mechanic, even if their overall proficiency is similar. Simply, if you have a vehicle, put a mechanic in it. They will be way better at piloting them than any other character. Finally, the last one is the scientist. He or she will heal your men as well as conduct research in a laboratory, which is actually very important throughout the entire game. But when it comes to their field operations, it's always a good idea to keep 2 or maybe even 3 of them in the rear of any advancing soldier group, so that they can heal them if their health gets too low. The reason for having more than one is to heal the other scientists if they get injured, as the AI will most likely prioritize them if they find themselves in the line of fire. They also are responsible for discovering cyberite or oil deposits on the map. These are all 4 of the classes available, but aside from different professions, each of the people under your command also has a concrete level in any given discipline, which can be of course trained further by doing the corresponding task. So if you want to make someone better at building stuff, let them help establishing a factory or a lab. If you want someone to be a better scientist, get them into the lab researching, or let him or her tend to the wounded. And you will want to train your people in as many disciplines as possible, not so much to make them a jack of all trades, but rather to make them tougher, because every level in any class counts toward the overall level of the character, which in turn makes them more durable on the battlefield. A group of decently leveled soldiers can wreak havoc and are a fair bit harder to kill. You can switch classes on the fly in any of the 4 basic buildings: the storage, lab, factory or barracks. Simply put, the levels and professions work like this. A level 5 soldier will deal way more damage than a mechanic that also has 5 levels as a soldier. On the other hand, when it comes to piloting vehicles, the mechanic will be more efficient given the same circumstances. The same goes for constructing buildings with the engineer. It's great that the devs decided to include these RPG elements into the game. True, they are rather simple, but even at that rudimentary level, they make the gameplay way more engaging, deep, and what's most important, fun. Now let's get back to our newly formed strike group and crack on. First, the less defended base. Ooh, tanks! Oh no, no you won't. After that brilliant assault, it's time for the second outpost. Easy as pie. But during that whole operation, something rather interesting happened. Right in the middle of the now occupied base teleports a Russian mechanic. A mechanic that is talking about a future vastly different from the one our heroes came from. It seems that this game dipped its toes into the alternate world future concept. But I honestly will not be dissecting this. It creates way more problems than it's worth. The main thing is that we and the Russians come from basically different worlds to an extent. And that's all there is to it for now. So, after capturing the mechanic and repelling an counterattack, it's time to head out. After a while, Macmillan and his group come into contact with Andy Cornell, his old military buddy, that was also sent here. But per Powell's orders, that's the guy on the radio, they are to split up and try to force the Russian defensive lines in 2 places. So one group might succeed and break through, while the other is basically slaughtered. I have my misgivings when it comes to this plan, as it would be better to attempt a breakthrough with overwhelming force concentrated in one point, but orders are orders, so let's get to it. Hey, it's the first mission where I can build something that can be driven. Yeah, it still isn't something that you could call a tank, but it's a start. These are more like armored off-road cars, and not heavily armed either. They will be easy pickings if they get under sustained fire. But hey, some protection is better than no protection, right? After I procured some vehicles, it's time to attempt a breakthrough. And wouldn't you know it, my group succeeded, which can't be said for the one led by Cornell. You will be sorely missed, friend. That I knew for the long time of about a minute. Well, he was Macmillan's friend, and that is more than enough to be pissed at Powell for coming up with this idiotic plan. So I will. Screw that guy. After my heroic breakthrough, I finally get some more information on what is going on exactly, and where are we standing. A guy named Ron Harrison is the commander of the main base, Alpha. He is in fact the leader of all American troops, as he almost single-handedly got things up and running, and the guy on the radio, Powell, is his right-hand man. You might think that Harrison is also an asshole, but you would be mistaken. He is a really stand-up guy and you can see why he is in charge. The Russians really do come from a different future, one in which the Americans successfully transported all the Cyberite to their territory, giving them an unbeatable advantage over the USSR. The Russians found evidence for the US meddling, and in their timeline it's them who found the Eon, and started sending whole squads to the past to stop the Americans. So it actually is theft what the US has done. They not only extracted Eon in their own timeline from Siberia, but also moved all the Cyberite to their territory, something that wasn't natively present in the American lands. But to be completely honest, I myself feel way better if the US has access to the Cyberite over the Russians, if I have to pick one, as there is historic precedent for them having access to something that no one else had. They had the atom, but didn't feel inclined to bomb everyone into submission, and that might be exactly the case if the USSR had access to it, or rather the sole access to the atom. And informed by recent events in the real world, mind you, this is recorded in 2022, it would stand to reason that if the Russians had the sole access to the atom bomb, or in this case Cyberite, we all would be speaking Russian now. So, go American campaign! But leaving this little detour aside, the more pressing matter is that they are a good few years ahead of the US in terms of development, so the Americans have to play catch-up. The USSR are entrenched in many sectors, and I myself have seen some of their tanks. One thing is painfully obvious: they are way more heavily armored and armed in comparison to the American vehicles, that up until now resembled more a buggy with a rifle strapped to the roof than an actual tank. Sure, these are more nimble, but that is small comfort when your group is shot to pieces by an overwhelming force. Simply put, we are not in a great place and something has to be done about it rather quick. And that is exactly what will be happening in the second part of the campaign. But before I go any further, let me do a brief detour to the Russian campaign. But allow me for another one little tiny break, to talk about one interesting thing: the style of intermissions for both factions. They differ significantly and are quite unique in their own right. The American ones are in the form of a sketch that is drawn as the narrator talks over it. And it is gorgeous. I always love those types of things. Watching how a sketch is drawn pulled me in even more than the actual narration. Not to imply that it was dull, but I just love this style of drawing. The Russians, on the other hand, keeping with their theme of technological fixation, whether it is warranted or not is an entirely different story, they have videos that have the feel of a DOS application. It looks cool, and gets across the cold approach of the Russian leadership to any undertaking, whether it involves people or not. It does feel like they are trying too hard, or at least try to convince themselves of how technologically sophisticated they are. That's great considering the relationship between the real-world USA and the USSR during the Cold War. It's a unique and quite to the point representation of both countries' self-perception. I think that only a studio from a country that once was a part of the Eastern Bloc can capture that in such a simple yet concrete way. I give the developers props for that. So now, let's see what the Russians are up to. On this side of the story, you get to control Gorky, a Russian mechanic. The first thing I noticed was how defenseless I felt not being a soldier. I felt somewhat naked running around without a rifle or a vehicle to at least take advantage of my hero's abilities. But after a while I came into contact with some soldiers who could take on the brunt of the enemy fire. And while playing this campaign, you get rather quickly the feeling that your side is way ahead of the Americans, with well-established bases, tanks and a thriving industry to back it all up. although the leadership leaves much to be desired. Which isn't really that surprising, as all of the Russian personnel is coming from the USSR. As history has shown us, their style of governing can't really work for a longer period of time, and at the same time produce good results. It will eventually collapse on itself. The difference in approach is actually staggering. Sure, Gorky is an intelligent guy who wants to make things better, but it's like smashing his head against the wall. Suffice to say, he's not really getting any results. But he does get the chance to build and name his own tank. So that has to account for something, right? And getting a little ahead of the American campaign here, there is a rather depth parallel to the Second World War, when the Russians retreat before an overwhelming attack, at the same time destroying everything behind them, as not to leave anything usable to fall into enemy hands. One thing is for sure, they do have experience with that. They have a mission basically dedicated to running and destroying all of what they have built, which does make me think back to what I know about Operation Barbarossa. I wonder if that was intentional, and seeing as the developers are Czech, it wouldn't even surprise me that much if it was. Now, let's back up a bit and jump to my main campaign and get on with the story. Harrison sent Macmillan to defend one of the already established bases. There isn't really anything more to this mission. I dug in, took my men, and then steamrolled the enemy base. It is actually quite easy if you don't leave the enemy time to get entrenched, which I didn't. But there is one thing that is worth talking about. It's another unique feature of this game. I know that technically it's not exclusively only in this game, but it's rather rare. What am I talking about? Well, you see, once I got to this base, I could upgrade my factory to actually look more like a factory and not a large tent. And then I got to build little extensions to that factory, allowing me to add different components to my vehicles. And components is the operative word here, cause you can mix and match almost anything with almost everything. The one exception being that heavier weapon systems require a more solid chassis. Each vehicle is combined by selecting a weapon system, a chassis, a steering system and an engine. There are very little limitations to this, and the exception was already mentioned. Get too heavy with your weapon and you will have to make the chassis more solid. That's it. So you might think that going straight for the heaviest types of tanks is the best option. Build only heavy hitters and you will be golden, right? Well, not really. While in, let's say, Red Alert 2, building a big blob of apocalypse tanks is always a good strategy, not so much here. First of all, there is the cost to consider. The more sophisticated you build, the more expensive it will become. But that's kind of standard. The second consideration is what type of chassis to use. Trucks are generally more durable and can go over more types of terrain, but wheels are many times way more nimble and fast. There is also the steering and engine to consider. The engine becomes pretty straightforward at some point. After researching the Cyberite engine, you see it never runs out of gas, different than the combustion one, and does not require any time to recharge as does the solar one. If it's feasible to build, you won't use anything else. During the first half of the game in the American campaign, you have to make a choice, and only in the American campaign. Everything the Russians build in the early missions will run on oil. Because solar power is for weak capitalists, and only their degenerate minds could come up with such a thing. Yeah, well, I myself many times opted for the solar-powered cars, as it didn't use resources apart from the initial cost, although they tend to lose energy rather fast during operation. This whole system isn't perhaps not unheard of, but it is still unique and a lot of fun. Although I still prefer to execute my assaults using only soldiers on foot, with a backup of scientists to heal them if need be. The most built vehicle for me was by far the transporter or crane. So in the mission I currently find myself in, I performed an assault using only my soldiers to destroy the Russian base, and received the next assignment to establish a new outpost and start training some ape men to bolster our ranks. Yeah, it sounds strange, and it is strange, but in this game it kind of makes sense, because it isn't entirely serious and complements one of the game's best mechanics. Perma-death. Yes, each of your men and women can die, and if they do, they stay dead. apart from Macmillan and Gorky, because their deaths mean game over for their respective campaigns. There are some significant characters that also have to stay alive, but this is very rare and lasts only one mission at most. That right here is important, because there isn't any way to produce more people to take on missions. Well, there is of course the obvious way, but it takes way too much time to be useful in this case. And no, there is no such mechanic. The only source of new combatants is mainly through the Eon. If you remember correctly, most things and people sent through the device land in the past with a few years tolerance. That means that they are appearing from time to time in rather random places, so if you lose someone, they are gone. And it really stings if it happens to a well-trained member of your squad. Such a loss is not easily replaceable. This will force you, as it did force me, to keep a good eye on my men, and use them wisely as not to put them in greater danger than it is necessary. There will be no producing masses of infantry and zerg rushing an enemy base. The game will make damn sure of it. It's honestly great, and I very fast learned to really value the lives of my people. It's one of the few games that makes you consider the individual life of an infantryman or woman. What's more, I really got attached to some of those side characters, which is rather surprising for an RTS. But what about the ape men? The point is, your scientists are able to tame them, and they can be trained as engineers. Well, sort of engineers. They can move supplies and help in constructing buildings, but they cannot lay the groundworks. Thank God, honestly. I even question how they know how to repair something, but it is what it is. They can be put to work gathering resources or on maintaining your base. To be completely honest, they also serve well as scouts, to send into places where I didn't want to send my people. Is it exploitative? Yeah, kind of, but it's better than to lose someone that can do way more than just basic engineering duties. The Russians can even train them to hold weapons. What is funny, the American commander also states such a desire in dialogue, but nothing will come of it. I wonder why. Anyway, I managed to tame some of the ape men and I'm ready for the next mission. Our scientists discovered that the supplies that arrive do so randomly, but most of it lands in a probably predictable area. That is the theory, and Macmillan will now set out to prove that theory. But seeing as I haven't yet talked about the stuff you construct buildings and vehicles with, it's a good time to do so. And it really is just stuff, apart from oil and cyberite. The idea is, there are crates sent from the future, which of course land randomly on the map. The guys back home are still sending things through the Eon. Presumably there are all sorts of materials in those crates, but you never find out if any given supply drop is made by the Americans or the Russians. That is actually funny, because I can easily imagine a situation where you get a Russian crate with Cyrillic instructions. Good luck deciphering that. Even if you live far closer to Russia, it would still be a challenge. And I should know, I never bothered to learn that language. And I doubt that the people sent through the Eon did either. Keep in mind, they did not expect to find Russians here. I know that gameplay-wise it was made for simplicity's sake, so no problem there. The catch is that they land randomly. It's highly probable that most of them will be snatched up by the enemy if you're not fast enough. And exactly to minimize that risk is my current mission. As it turns out, the theory is not a theory anymore. My scientists were able to locate the drops on the map when they occur, thus giving me a head start on collecting them. Additionally, they found a way to make my tanks remotely controlled. One mechanic can now steer many more vehicles depending on his level. The one other mode of remote steering is leaving it to an AI. And no, it isn't sentient in any way. It's just a convenient method so that the tanks don't require a driver or a mechanic in a tower to control it. The one drawback is that it will never be as efficient as one piloted by a reasonably high-level mechanic, or even remotely controlled by one. But it frees up a tremendous amount of workforce that can be used to complete other tasks. By the way, turrets can also be controlled by an AI. Hey, who are you? And what is that accent? German? Do they also have the Eon? What the heck is going on here? These guys always seem to want to get involved if a world war is going on. This guy just appeared near my base and is spewing nonsense. But after a while I can make out a somewhat coherent guess as to why he is here and what happened, as the other clue is given by Macmillan's love interest that just so happened to be teleported right into his base. Yeah, convenient, but what the hell, it's nice to have her here. She said that she used the Eon to escape from a mercenary attack, and that would mean that the American base where the Eon is kept was attacked by mercenaries? How? Simply how? They overpowered the American army and got access to top secret machinery? It would make way more sense if it was a covert op, you know, a one-time deal, after which anyone who didn't get through the Eon was summarily executed or at least apprehended. And after a bit of thought, I will go with that option. It seems that the Arabs hired some German mercenaries and attacked the base containing the Eon to get back in time, to stop that dangerous thing of making the world not reliant on fossil fuels. Well, their logic makes sense, but I still to this day struggle to comprehend how a group of mercenaries and Arab sheiks got to take over an American base deep in the US territory, even if only for a moment. As I see it, they would be mowed down in an instant, long before they could even lay eyes on the Eon. But it is what it is, no point dwelling on it. The game calls them Arabs, or Legion, but this term encapsulates both the actual Arabs as well as the German mercenaries. It can be confusing in some missions, as the mercenaries will often want to switch sides. It's by far the most perplexing part of the game. This is quite the amount of developments for one mission, but that's a good thing, as the next events don't really leave much room for major additions. Wouldn't you know it, it seems that the Russians have fallen on some hard times, as they are heavily pressed by the Legion. What a shame. Which means that some of their bases will have only the most basic stuff at hand, while the rest is trying to stave off the new threat. And this is where I come in, like a knight in a shining armor, to exploit that situation. Always count on me to strike the enemy when he's weak, that's the honorable thing to do. But in all seriousness, this approach is a good call, as it's simply stupid to attack where the opponent is strongest. It's way more efficient and less costly to exploit an opening. And seeing as the lives of my men and women are precious, I will not put them in any unnecessary danger. This assault on the Russian base is actually tons of fun. I always like to destroy buildings in this game, but that doesn't mean it will be a walk in the park. They developed AI technology, so most of the turrets around the base are active and dangerous. So I go in from the side, hit their power plants and then the storage, which takes the whole automatic defense system offline. The one thing remaining is just to mop up the few soldiers left in the base and destroy as much as we can. Cause somewhere during the mission Harrison calls and orders Macmillan to return to base ASAP. It seems that the Russians dealt with the Legion threat and are pressing our defenses to knock us out of the picture once and for all, which is something that I won't let happen. After Macmillan arrived back at base, there is a bit of cleaning up to do, which goes rather efficiently. Then I built a barracks smack dab in the middle of the road to block any enemy advances, and then performed a decapitation strike with my soldiers. Yeah, it's easier said than done. I miscalculated more than once with that strike. It took me a few approaches to finally get rid of the Russians. But the aftermath of this whole affair wasn't a happy one. Ron Harrison died in the attacks and Powell was voted as the new leader. When it rains it pours, right? But I do not begrudge Powell that the first decision he made was to appoint himself as general. That is the exact same thing I would do, or even Macmillan should do. It would be way too complicated to have someone outrank the military leader in a mostly military operation, seeing as there is still no civilian infrastructure in place to govern, which is something that I hope will be someday instituted, as a society ruled over by military personnel isn't something immensely healthy for anyone, maybe apart from the soldiers themselves. It would pose massive danger to spiral into a dictatorship. But luckily the Americans have liberal traditions, so I do hope they will manage to figure it out after this whole ordeal is over. Can't really say that I have the same high hopes for the Russian side, as dictatorships is the one thing that they are most proficient at. The fact that the new leader doesn't like Macmillan is a bit of an understatement. Moreover, he isn't even sure about his loyalty. After all, he is the guy who got only a couple less votes than the general. Who knows if John isn't planning to overthrow him? Well, he isn't, but I wouldn't be surprised if Powell thinks that he is at this point in time. So he sends John on a rather dangerous mission and doesn't allow him to take any of his trusted men with him. Yeah, that's a great start. But no point in complaining. Let's do what must be done. I get to the site and meet up with the people there, and head out to the center of the map, where the mine is supposed to be located. Oh, right, I forgot to tell you what the plan was. Well, finally, after a while getting acclimated and establishing a stronger American presence, it's finally time to get some cyberite. If you remember correctly, that is the actual mission everyone was sent here with. And we definitely need more of this stuff for our own purposes and research. So our people liberated a Russian outpost with a mine. But while the enemy soldiers were fleeing, they damaged and destroyed almost everything. But I got it sorted and the mining began anew, at least for a while. The outpost is constantly attacked by Russians, with their freaking rocket launchers. Can someone explain to me how a rocket launcher can fire on my barracks that are located on a hill without my guys returning fire? This is infuriating in this mission, but I will make do. After enough crystals are mined, let's pack up and leave. Finally, those rocket attacks were starting to get on my nerves. Question: what do you do when you have cyberite that is way more potent than any atom fuel on the Earth? Yes, you're right, you will try and make a bomb out of it. It isn't even that surprising, seeing as the military is in charge. Powell got into contact with the Arabs and decided on a research sharing program to boost our output. I don't like this idea that much really, but orders are orders. Although, to be on the safe side, I will build barracks in an easily defendable position between my base and theirs. You know, just in case. Then there is the usual. The Russians attack, mercenaries attack, the Arabs attack. Wait, what? Yeah, they stabbed us in the back. Good thing that I had those barracks built. It was a rather unwise betrayal. So, the cooperation with them was a rather short-lived affair. But at least there came the sniper specialization out of this mission. Actually, this is something that I should talk a bit more about. The basic soldier loadout can be modified with 3 other weapon types. Each faction has an upgrade specific to them. If used correctly, they can cause enormous damage to the enemy. And the fun is that they differ significantly and shine in different circumstances. The sniper is the American specialization. They see a bit more and can shoot considerably farther. But what's most important is that they can dispatch enemy soldiers with ease. True, it won't do any good against buildings or computer-driven tanks, but when it comes to humans or ape men, they will zero them with ease. Even if someone sits inside the vehicle, the sniper will damage them directly. A few shots will definitely put the driver out of commission, without damaging the tank that much. Too bad that most of the enemy tanks will be automatic in the late game, but it still comes in handy. They also can use special ammunition that puts a human to sleep, but I can't really tell you much about it, as it isn't something that I use that often. The Russians can equip their soldiers with a bazooka. Great against buildings and vehicles, a bit less against humans, which is hilarious to me. Seeing how rapid fire that thing is, it should tear through human enemies with ease, but that is how the game sees it, so I won't complain. It's just that if a rocket is good at destroying heavy machinery, it should also be pretty good with squishy humans if a hit is accurate. Yeah, accurate. That actually seems to be the biggest drawback of the bazooka. If someone is moving, it's entirely possible to avoid the missiles altogether. As their special ability, they can use rockets to create a slowdown field, or displace enemies via limited teleportation. In the case of the first ability, everything that comes into the area of effect will be slowed down to a crawl. The second special rocket will scatter enemies on a small area, teleporting them at random. Yeah, these are weird abilities, but in this universe where the Eon exists, it perhaps isn't that unexpected. The one thing that surprised me way more is that the Russians have these crazy inventions, not the Americans. I grew long accustomed from other games that it's the US or the Allies that have the less armed and armored stuff, but more technologically sophisticated. In this case, it seems that the Russians do have the heavy equipment, but also the weird sciencey stuff. I see it as a fun twist from where I'm standing. The last specialization is the Arab mortar operator. Let me tell you, this class is a beast. It has incredible range and deals a ton of damage. It can even destroy most turrets beyond visual range. It's a great idea to combine them with snipers while planning an assault, which is actually very viable in many missions, as there are quite a few with access to both factions' barracks. This specialization is actually my favorite. Cleaning out an enemy base with these guys, with let's say 3 snipers and 2 scientists, is my favorite squad to conduct an operation. So, there you have it. All 3 special soldier classes that honestly can make vehicle combat sometimes obsolete. But let's get back to the game and see what can be done after the Arab betrayal. Well, something rather surprising happened. Powell pulled aside Macmillan to ask for his opinion. This is rather significant. The general really changed his mind about John. Maybe not to a point where he is willing to admit this publicly, but still, props to him for admitting when he was wrong and made some questionable decisions. The matter at hand is an information from some of the Legion saying that they want to defect and leave a base wide open for an attack. It seems fishy, but it's a prime opportunity to weaken them significantly, one that the Americans can't pass up. So it's decided to trust this information and see what happens. It turns out that they were really telling the truth. The first base was easy pickings, then came the second and the third. With snipers and mortar operators at my disposal, it all went swimmingly. The one thing I had to watch out for were ape men strapped with dynamite. Yeah, the Arabs invented suicide ape men. I'm not really sure how to feel about it. Either way, my snipers made short work out of them. But there is one curious thing in this mission. In one of the bases there is an artifact to be found. One that in many ways resembles the Eon, but what their purpose is still unknown, and probably will forever remain so, because there is no sequel to this game. The mission was a grand success, so let's return to base and prepare for the final act of the story. During the small intermission, it's made abundantly clear that we are in the endgame now. If I wanted, I could even make Macmillan join the Alliance, a ragtag group from both factions, one that wants to form an alternative to the 2 warring ones, and study the artifacts that were found in the meantime. To be perfectly honest, I never liked the Alliance plotline. It felt somehow like they didn't have any plan for the most part. Which is actually very tangibly true. They figure it out along the way. Besides, they are regarded as traitors by both sides, so I will stay with the main American faction and soldier on. Now, let's hop to the Russian campaign for a brief second, just to talk about one specific assignment that Gorky gets from his higher-ups. He gets the honor of constructing a new main base for his faction. It is, without a doubt, my #1 mission in the entire game. There is barely any combat in it, only a few snipers to take care of and an assault at the end, which wasn't any problem for my base. You have to bulldoze trees, gather resources, and most importantly, build and research everything that can be built and researched up until that point. And there is no time limit. The leisurely pace of this mission and the fact that I could construct everything in peace and relative quiet made it the best experience that I had playing this game. That of course doesn't mean that the rest is bad. No, not by any stretch of the imagination. But there always is this one mission, one vista point or one quest that sears itself into your memory, and for me, this is the one. Plus, I could finally plan out the layout of my base and not slap every building in the place furthest from the front lines, and more often than not in the only place where I could even build something. So that's that. Now let's get back to Macmillan and the Americans. My next assignment is painfully straightforward. Destroy the enemy base and kill all the researchers to set back the Russian progress on a Cyberite bomb. My snipers took care of that. The most interesting thing that happens here is the discovery that the enemy can now create fields that will slow you down and create and teleport. Remember when I told you that the Russians have all the interesting tech in this game? They can build a teleporting device that is hard linked with a place on the map and will periodically send tanks through it to mess with your base. I handled it by setting up turrets in the place where they appeared, as this remained static through the whole mission. It's a rather annoying new ability, one that requires you to build up defenses in places that normally wouldn't need any such fortifications. It still feels a bit awkward that the commies came up with the interesting space-bending stuff. Well, it is what it is. Now finally, everything is in place to build the Cyberite bomb, and that is exactly what I will do next. I have to watch out for Legion attacks. They will be throwing themselves against my defenses time and time again. They will even try to sabotage my Cyberite mine here in the desert. But that is the one thing I will definitely not let them do. The funny thing is that the dialogue glitched and the game warned me ahead of time that this will happen, a good while before the Legion scientist actually attempted to do that. Good for me, bad for them. After a long time researching and subsequent building, the Cyberite bomb is finally ready. So I tested on some buildings to see its effectiveness. And I can say one thing, it's damn effective. A game changer, so to speak. But there is one thing that keeps bothering me. In the American intro, Cyberite is presented as a mineral that doesn't emit any radiation. None whatsoever. It is said though to produce ungodly amounts of heat after coming into contact with water, but still no radioactivity. So why is there a radioactive fallout after the bomb is detonated? Or after the Legion sabotages my mine? There are supposedly some compounds or bindings in the Cyberite that can cause such a thing, but as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't make much sense. But that didn't stop me the whole game, so why start now? I'm having way too much fun to be deterred by this. It's just something that I find interesting, and besides, it very well may be that I'm simply missing something. Be it as it may, the bomb is ready. Now it's time to find the main Cyberite deposit and seize control over it. The fact that something like that could exist is implied by the research notes found in the Russian laboratories. Yes, in the ones that they were trying to develop the bomb in. I'm ready now for the final showdown at the main Cyberite vein. But something strange happens while Macmillan is on his way to get there. And that something is my second favorite mission in this game, right after the Russian base building one. Joanne calls John on the radio. That's Macmillan's love interest that teleported here a while back, telling him that she is in trouble, and now I have to decide if I help her or listen to Powell and go straight ahead to the last mission. And seeing as I still don't like Powell that much, and there is no way in hell that Macmillan would leave Joanne for certain death, I decided to help her. Plus, it is really a very stupid idea to leave a fully operational enemy base right at my rear. Powell doesn't strike me as a great strategist, so to be honest, I chose to show some initiative. And truth be told, I simply love this mission, because it's sort of a conundrum. The base is abandoned for all intents and purposes. Well, mostly abandoned. There is only Joanne and maybe 2 ape men, and Macmillan if you decide to go there. The ape men are good at collecting crates and repairing stuff, but the whole rest must be performed by the 2 humans. You have to prioritize what you want to do as soon as possible, because there are only 2 tasks at any given time that will be made progress on. So is it worth to progress some research? Or is it better to lay down some foundations for buildings, or perhaps build new tanks? Or place someone in the tower to steer the vehicles that are sitting idle in the base at the moment? This juggling with the task assignment is tons of fun, slowly getting the base in order and in working condition. In my case, I opted to get rid of the remote control tanks, and replacing them with ones driven by an AI, to then concentrate on building up better defenses and researching everything that there is to research in the meantime. It forced me to be more efficient with the time of my personnel, and I had to put way more thought in what tasks to prioritize next. After a while, the base was a well-oiled machine, capable of defending itself and gathering resources without much of my input really. An almost fully automated base. I must admit, I was sort of proud of it. It could tie down enemy forces with great efficiency and minimal losses. But as far as I'm concerned, there is still the small matter of the enemy base in this region. I make a few tanks with rocket launchers and a radar and sneak. Yeah, I know it sounds stupid, but I snuck 3 tanks through the mountains in the east to attack the Russian base from the rear. All in a day's work. With my bug now secured, let's leave the mopping up to Joanne and head to the main Cyberite deposit. I am very well ready and willing to show the Russians who's boss. It's the one mission where every faction is present. The Legion, the Alliance, the Americans and of course the Russians, which are currently occupying a giant mountain in the east, right smack up on the main Cyberite vein. So you could say that the race is over, lost. The Russians got there first and entrenched themselves. But it wouldn't be a tension-packed last mission if I left this status quo unchallenged. First, Powell orders me to protect his main base from the south. So I do the sensible thing. Build a barracks, as always, and wait for the enemy to attack. If I just got mortars, this setup would be impenetrable. Powell, on the other hand, orders attacks against the Legion base, that is situated on a little hill to the north. To say that these attacks don't go according to plan is an more than a little understatement. And after the Arabs destroy our factory via remotely controlled bomb, the general snaps and, you know, at least he left a lasting impression on the Arabs. So now, finally, the command goes to Macmillan. First thing first, a few rocket launches and make short work of the Legion defenses, after which they join me, seeing as they know me as a good leader and not a bloodthirsty monster, thanks to my decisions up until now. Yeah, the decisions made before factor into the later missions, and it's great to have the Legion on board, because I finally get access to that mortar. So what the flying fuck is this? A behemoth? And 3 of them to boot? Freaking hell! These are special weapons designed and built by the Russians, and they will keep building them until I destroy their assembly site. Combine that with the unrelenting attacks coming from the east and off-map from the south, it's a constant barrage of attacks. There is almost no time to catch a breath. Plus these annoying idiots from the Alliance are standing by the trees, teleporting any of my men that get too close to them. It's a clusterfuck. But you might ask why I'm not building a Cyberite bomb and nuke them to hell. Well, there is a problem with that. While the Cyberite rocket is useful to make sure that the Russians don't nuke me, you know, mutually assured destruction, if I launch it on the Russian positions, right on the main Cyberite vein, this would cause a chain reaction that could destroy the whole planet. And yeah, it will, I checked. So the only thing to do is gather up my soldiers, mortars and snipers only, and storm the hill on foot. In this mission this approach is by far the easiest. After a long slog to the center of the enemy base, the main Cyberite vein is secured. The Americans can now start transporting this stuff to Alaska. It will take time, but with the war over, they have earned that time. Before I talk about the ramifications of the ending, there is one small thing that happens right before the end. A sheik on a mastodon together with his mercenaries stormed the summit in order to take it over. And I honestly trying to understand what his thought process was. Both the Americans and the Russians are giant factions in this world. How in the world did he think he can seize the initiative here with a mere couple of soldiers? Oh well, probably desperation. Suffice to say, this little group didn't survive the raid. Now let me briefly talk about what the Russians could be up to. Of course, apart from Gorky joining the alliance. If he stays with the military, he makes a power play to seize control over the whole operation. Of course by killing the current leader. To be honest, after that it's the first time that the Russians have someone competent at the helm. The mission where Gorky does that is also kind of interesting. There are 6 bases on the map, all Russian, and Gorky has to convince a few of them to take up arms against the general. One has even a trivia test about the communist revolution. It actually was quite fun to try and convince all of them. After that he will try to locate and protect the main vein. And the last mission is quite tricky. The enemy is well fortified, which poses the obvious problems. But you will also have to make sure that no one other than you will build any Cyberite mines on the main vein. I failed the first few attempts because I didn't fully grasp this one victory condition. But if the main deposit is secured, there can be a communist paradise established 2 million years in the past. Yeah, thanks but no thanks, I think I'll pass. But before all that happens, there is one little hiccup along the road. The Russian main base gets destroyed, and by main base I mean the one that I so painstakingly built. And I call bullshit on that. There is no chance in hell that the defenses that I created would be overcome. No, I do not accept that. I will chuck it all up to incompetent management. By the way, this attack is the indirect cause of the later change in management. And now, I know I have been putting it off for as long as I could, but it's finally time to talk about the Alliance. It's actually where both of the factions' storylines can converge, because this path is almost the same for both Americans and Russians. There seem to be only minor differences between them, but the most important thing, apart from ideological differences, you see, the Alliance seeks to end the war, and of course they do it using mostly violent methods. But it's an RTS, it was to be expected. The most important thing is that you will have access to both Russian and American technologies. That is actually huge. Just imagine, snipers and soldiers with bazookas in the same team, not to mention the more passive research, like locating crates and the radio tower on one side and the teleporter on the other. Plus the Alliance has discoveries specific to them, due to the study of the artifacts already found. To be honest, it's the only faction that is in any way serious about researching them. So this faction should be the most fun to play, right? Well, I would be lying if I said that it isn't, because having access to all these different things is like being in a candy shop. But for me, I still like the base US or the base Russian campaign. It gives me way more satisfaction than this branch. Maybe it seems more coherent, more put together than this ragtag band of rebels. But I wouldn't begrudge anyone for choosing this branch, as it's easily the most interesting path when it comes to the tools at your disposal and revelations about the artifacts, or rather the tech that can be derived from them. So, to sum it up, they are intriguing and interesting to play, but not for me personally. Now finally onto the ramifications of the US ending. Sure, the main deposit is secured and will be moved to Alaska, but how on earth will that make the US in the future the same as we know it now in the real world? There is no coming back to the future, that was made clear in the opening cinematic. Eon only works one way. So the people that were sent to the past will have to live here to the end of their days. But then presumably they would form new societies, new countries. They would start to multiply as well, as it is one of our basic drives. So the future from which they came is unobtainable for them or any of their descendants for that matter. Unless, of course, the other artifacts that were found allowed to travel back. But to be perfectly honest, as I stated in the beginning, I will not look into the time traveling mechanics any more than this. Time travel plots are so full of inconsistencies that it's meaningless to try and figure it out here. The main point is that it serves as the frame for the whole game, nothing more, and I will treat it as such. Because I had way too much fun playing it, to now sit around and think about it if it makes any sense. It probably doesn't, and that's okay. It's a shame that not many people played this game. Outside of the Czech Republic and Poland, it seems to be virtually unknown, which should be rectified somehow. More people have to discover this classic gem. There are many interesting mechanics included in Original War. Sure, some of them needed a bit more polishing, but they mesh together surprisingly well. Plus, it really is a beautiful game. It is simply pleasant to look at. I wonder if it was released by a more known studio, onto the international market with more marketing behind it. If it would be somewhere besides Red Alert in terms of popularity, well, we will probably never know. That is all I have for you this time. I hope you enjoyed it, even if you didn't play the game. Have a good one, and perhaps we will hear us in the next in-depth look.